Tonight at 10, the clearest hint yet that Britain's future after Brexit will be outside the European single market. Liam Fox, in his first major speech as International Trade Secretary, says business with the EU after Brexit will be at least as free as it is today.
The UK is in a prime position to become a world leader in free trade because of the brave and historic decision of the British people to leave the European Union.
But another EU leader has stepped forward to warn that Britain can't expect any special treatment and must make a move.
We discussed a lot of times about Brexit, so now it's time to solve the question.
We'll have more from the Italian Prime Minister and the speech by Liam Fox on his vision for Britain's future trading relationships. Also tonight, in New Jersey, a commuter train crashes during the morning rush hour. At least one person died, hundreds were injured.
It was like a big crash, and then everything from the ceiling just like fell in.
Another football manager, this time Tommy Wright of Barnsley, is out of a job following more allegations of corruption. Flying through the upper atmosphere, tracking the jet stream, a new attempt to improve weather prediction.
We're now flying right through the heart of the jet stream. The winds are ripping along at 180 miles an hour.
And a visit to Northern Ireland's newest arts centre in Seamus Heaney's home village.
Here, a bomb alert closes Gunwharf Quays tonight as a huge World War II device is found in the harbour. And Saints assistant manager Eric Black is named in a Telegraph football investigation.
Good evening. In his first major speech since taking office, the International Trade Secretary Liam Fox has offered his thoughts on the UK's trading relationships once Britain leaves the European Union. He suggested Britain would establish itself as an independent member of the World Trade Organization, and that is widely seen as an indication that he favours a so-called hard Brexit outside the European single market. EU leaders have again warned that Britain will not get any kind of special treatment when it leaves the EU. Our economics editor, Kamal Ahmed, has more details.
Taking back control. Dr. Liam Fox, today at a flight simulation business, trying to plot a smooth landing for Britain, where free trade is the cornerstone of our relationship with the European Union and the rest of the world.
I believe that the UK is in a prime position to become a world leader in free trade because of the brave and historic decision of the British people to leave the European Union. Those who believe that the referendum was a sign of Britain looking inwards have it completely, 100% wrong.
Yesterday, car manufacturers in Britain warned that if there were tariffs between Britain and the European Union once we had left, that could mean job losses. Do you agree with that?
Who does it harm more if we end up in a new tariff environment? It's in everybody's interest that as we move forward, we have at least as free a trading environment as we have today. Anything else may not harm the politicians and the institutions, but it will harm the people of Europe.
This is Manchester Town Hall, a monument to the glories of our free trade past. And it was here that Dr. Fox gave, I think, the strongest signal about the future. Not only would Britain be leaving the European Union, we would be leaving the single market. This feels like a hard Brexit. At the Paris Motor Show, concern. A hard Brexit would mean Britain out of the single market, and that could mean tariffs, an extra cost on imports and exports. For the Nissan boss, and that company runs a huge factory in Sunderland, that can only mean one thing.
It would mean, obviously, that Sunderland will lose competitiveness when it comes to choosing a place where we will be sourcing the products for Europe, because all of a sudden you're taking 10% higher cost for tax reasons.
From big business to small business.
These conveyors here are going to Sweden.
This one near Manchester makes conveyor belts. The message is the same.
Tariff-free trade is extremely important to us. We do not want to be put at a disadvantage by incurring additional costs, because in a competitive market you can't put your prices up to reflect it.
Britain's trade exports are one of the fundamental drivers of economic growth. We export £222 billion worth of goods to the EU, a trade few want to put at risk. That is more than twice the £100 billion worth of exports that go to America, and nearly 10 times the £26 billion worth of exports that go to China. The UK's trade with the EU matters. Dr. Fox came to Manchester to send a message. Britain wants free trade deals. But negotiations with the EU post-Brexit won't officially start for years. Yes, the tone at the moment is tough, but this journey has an awful long way to go. Kamal Ahmed, BBC News, Manchester.
Well, the latest European leader to sound a warning about British expectations is the Italian Prime Minister, Matteo Renzi, and he's told the BBC it will be impossible to give Britain superior rights to other countries outside the EU. Mr. Renzi joins other leaders in insisting that Britain won't be able to have a deal which involves free trade without also accepting freedom of movement. He's been speaking to our Europe editor, Katja Adler.
Italy is one of the EU's oldest members. It remains hugely influential on the EU stage, despite its well-publicised economic and political troubles. Italians, enamoured as they are of their culture, their coffee, their style, are huge Anglophiles too. News of the UK's Brexit vote was met with dismay here, expressed clearly to me by Matteo Renzi, Italy's Prime Minister.
The decision of British people is a bad decision in my mind, and I'm sad for that. But if we don't accept the result of referendum, the risk is give the message, vote is not a good thing. Democracy is not an asset for this continent, and this is impossible.
So you think it's definitely going to happen?
For me, yes.
And how should it happen? I mean, obviously Britain has to trigger Article 50 for official talks to start. In what mood should they be? I mean, how tough should they be?
When British people, British government will decide to open Article 50, I think we will work as soon as possible in only one way to solve every problem, but will be impossible give to British people more rights than the other people out of EU.
So we're clearly talking about the freedom of movement here, right? Aren't you asking for flexibility in the Eurozone? Couldn't you allow flexibility for the UK when it comes to freedom of movement?
I think this is a very interesting debate, because this debate will be a debate about the concept of rules in EU. But when UK will decide the opening of Article 50, we will discuss about it.
Okay, the UK hasn't triggered Article 50 yet. We don't really know when it will trigger it. What's the mood amongst your other EU leaders?
There is the need to solve as soon as possible the problem of UK, because from 2015 to today, for the first months of 2015 to today, we discussed a lot of times about Brexit. So now it's time to solve the question.
Because, like many other EU countries, Italy is faced with other pressing crises, not just Brexit. Stagnant growth, high youth unemployment, endemic corruption. Never mind the ongoing migrant crisis and Euro woes here. Matteo Renzi has promised to change Italy or change jobs. Tonight he launched a referendum campaign to slimline Parliament, making it easier to pass reforms.
It's a huge political gamble. Doesn't that worry you?
I know in 2016 use expression referendum in EU, it's a risk. But jokes apart, I believe this is a great challenge for Italian people, because this constitutional reform reduces the red tape of bureaucracy, gives stability to Italian institutions, and I'm not worried.
We went back a few months and David Cameron wasn't worried. He must have told you at EU Summit, I'm not worried about the referendum in the UK. And look what happened to him. He lost and his political career was finished.
Thank you so much for this benchmark. I hope the result will be different, but I think this is a very different referendum. I thought, obviously, there are a lot of risks, but it's impossible to have a great challenge as Italian government without risk.
If Matteo Renzi loses his referendum, the man who promised to reform and stabilise Italy could plunge it into further political and economic uncertainty with an impact on the wider Eurozone. But if he wins, not only will Matteo Renzi be stronger here at home, but also in Brussels. And with EU powers France and Germany distracted by their own general elections, Italy's Anglophile, Europhile Prime Minister could play a key role in Brexit negotiations when they start in earnest.
Katja, thanks very much. Katja Adler there in Rome, our Europe editor. Now, a train with more than 200 passengers on board has crashed into a busy station in the US state of New Jersey. At least one person died and more than 100 were injured, some of them seriously. The train failed to stop as it came into Hoboken Station across the Hudson River from Manhattan. It smashed through a concrete barrier, causing extensive damage to the station structure. Our correspondent Nick Bryant sent this report from New Jersey.
A packed train entering a crowded station at the peak of rush hour. A routine morning commute that turned in an instant into a terrifying ordeal. The train kept up its speed as it entered the station, ploughing through crash barriers at the end of the track, slamming into the wall of a waiting area.
The second car kind of like jumped a little bit onto the first, like where we were standing, so it kind of like crushed that little center where people were.
It was like a big crash, and then everything from the ceiling just like fell in.
I saw one woman, she was on the ground, she needed medical, she started to receive medical attention, but then they kind of just left her there, and so I figured there was nothing more that they could do for her. She was just lying in like a pool of blood.
The engine was at the rear, pushing the passenger carriages. They bore the brunt of the crash. So powerful was the impact of the crash that part of the roof caved in, turning the concourse into a jumble of collapsed pillars, twisted metal and hanging wires. The woman who died was killed by falling debris. Hoboken is in New Jersey, across the Hudson River from New York City. Many commuters use this busy station to travel into Manhattan, and many tend to pack the front carriages of the trains to shave a few minutes off their journeys. 108 people were injured, and most of them were on board the train.
The silver lining is that there's only been one fatality thus far, because the destruction really is significant, and the power of the train coming in is obviously devastating in its impact.
The cause of the crash is not yet known. The train's engineer was critically injured, but is conscious and cooperating with investigators. New Jersey Transit hasn't completed installing what's called positive train control, a safety system designed to prevent accidents by automatically slowing or stopping trains that are going too fast. It had been ordered to install the system by the government, but there have been repeated delays. Now, there's been a spate of train crashes in America's Northeast Corridor in recent years, and in 2011 there was a very similar crash at this very station, where a train failed to stop as it was coming into the concourse. So many commuters tonight are asking a simple question: why hasn't this speed control technology been fitted on their trains, especially when America's National Transportation Safety Board first called for its introduction more than 25 years ago?
Nick, thanks again. Nick Bryant for us there, correspondent with the latest in New Jersey. Now, Russia has insisted it will continue its airstrikes in support of the Syrian government, rejecting a warning from the United States that it will abandon talks unless the attacks on Aleppo are stopped. Moscow also rejected calls by the US Secretary of State John Kerry for a 7-day ceasefire, saying that that would allow rebels to regroup. The UN has again highlighted the plight of those trapped in Syria's second city, saying hundreds of injured people are unable to get the treatment that they desperately need. Young women have the highest risk of developing mental illness, according to the latest research, and they are 3 times as likely to suffer from conditions such as anxiety and depression as men of the same age. According to a report by the NHS in England, more than a quarter of women aged 16 to 24 had mental health problems in 2014, and a similar number said that they had self-harmed on at least one occasion. Our health editor, Hugh Pym, has the story.
The pressures of modern life, the growth in social media, the pursuit of perfection. Whatever the explanation, there's new evidence of a rise in mental health problems, particularly among young women.
I've been struggling with anxiety.
I binge and purge, and I have depression.
I think there's a lot of pressure on us because at this age you're expected to do so much.
The new survey reveals a sharp increase in women aged 16 to 24 in England with mental health symptoms. Alice Thompson, who's 17, can vouch for that. She's suffered from anxiety, self-harm and eating disorders. She's in treatment now, but says her conditions have been overwhelming.
Anxiety feels like you're in a stream or even an ocean, and it's just waves crashing at you constantly, and you're treading water, and the more you tread water, the harder it is to keep going, because you just get tired and you get lethargic and you just end up drowning eventually.
So what are the reasons? The report doesn't suggest causes, but mentions factors like the state of the economy and the growth of social media, with teenagers facing peer group pressure and potentially vulnerable to online bullying.
This is the first cohort to come of age in a context of social media, and we don't yet understand what social media means for the mental health of people as they enter adulthood. But this is something that perhaps this study suggests warrants further investigation.
2 people with personal experience of mental illness told me why they thought the pressures were increasing.
The world becomes more and more of a kind of stressful place to be. Like, we're exposed to more and more information that comes at us faster and faster, and we're just not really taught how to kind of cope with that and like how to manage our own emotional well-being.
You have to have the perfect body, you have to like be great at school, you have to have really great like prospects in life, you have to have a group of friends, you have to have a like great boyfriend, and just everything be like perfect, but it just doesn't work that way, and people put so much pressure on themselves to like fulfill these completely unrealistic expectations that people just can't cope with it.
Colleges and universities are doing what they can to help at the start of the new term. At Bradford College, there's a room set aside for young people to relax and talk openly about issues they face.
As much as it does feel like a barrier, it isn't, because there's so many other people that carry that same weight that can help you. Like, I've met people that have anxiety and stuff, and that are doing really well.
A recent Scottish survey also found significantly lower levels of mental well-being amongst young women compared to other age groups. That's further evidence of a growing challenge for government, the NHS, and of course, young people. Hugh Pym, BBC News.
Let's have a brief look then at some of the day's other news stories now. And the senior counsel on the independent inquiry into child sex abuse has resigned. Ben Emerson QC was suspended yesterday over concerns about his leadership. Today, his resignation was accepted by the inquiry's chair, Professor Alexis Jay. Police in Oxford say a schoolgirl who was abducted and raped by 2 men yesterday was made to suffer a 4-hour ordeal. The attack happened at around 8:15 a.m. in the Banbury Road area. She walked to school. Police say they want to trace 2 white men and a silver hatchback car, and they've appealed for information, especially from any local cyclists. Britain's most senior police officer, Sir Bernard Hogan-Howe, has announced his retirement as Commissioner of the Metropolitan Police. Sir Bernard, who's been in charge since 2011, will leave in February next year. That is 7 months before his contract ends. Tommy Wright, the assistant manager of Barnsley Football Club, has become the second person to lose his job because of an investigation into alleged corruption. He's been accused by the Daily Telegraph of agreeing to accept money to facilitate transfers. Earlier this week, Sam Allardyce stepped down as England manager. The chairman of Premier League Stoke City has also called for a clampdown on agents and their fees, and he's been talking to our sports editor, Dan Rowan.
Well, listen, we've got to give them some ready to get them started.
If you thought envelopes stuffed full of cash had been consigned to football's bad old days, think again. This is assistant Barnsley manager Tommy Wright, secretly filmed apparently being given £5,000.
You're the man to do it.
The Daily Telegraph alleges the payment was in return for helping a fake Far Eastern firm place players at the Championship club. Wright denied breaking any rules, but having been suspended, today he was sacked. Other names revealed today include Queen's Park Rangers manager Jimmy Floyd Hasselbank, filmed apparently negotiating a fee to travel to speak to the firm, and Leeds United owner Massimo Cellino, allegedly offering to get around third-party ownership rules. Both deny any wrongdoing, but the scrutiny on the sport's integrity is intensifying.
We know that there's been little, bungs, brown paper envelopes, whatever you want to call them, that have gone on between people in the game, whether they're managers, whether they're coaches, whether they're executives at football clubs. We know it's gone on. There's enough evidence out there to suggest, but there's never been, I don't think, a really prolonged, proper investigation, perhaps by the correct authorities.
This crisis has already cost the England manager his job, embroiled several unnamed Premier League bosses, and now claimed a second scalp here at Barnsley. The FA are investigating, but they admit that their powers to fully police a globalised multi-billion-pound sport are limited, and it's notoriously difficult to prove corruption. George Graham, sacked by Arsenal in 1995, remains the only manager in the English game to be punished for accepting underhand payments. Lord Stevens headed up a Premier League bungs inquiry in 2006, but found no evidence clubs or officials had taken illegal payments. So what can be done? Today, one club owner told me the sport must get a grip on the amounts paid to agents.
I wondered whether, if collectively we could agree that we would not, say, pay more than 10%, or we have a parameters between 5 and 10%, and try and bring some better order into it. Although these things are coming out, and we'll have to judge them on their merits, in my view, the game has never been cleaner.
But with the sport bracing itself for more allegations, confidence in the whole of the game is now on the line. Dan Rowan, BBC News, Barnsley.
Now, some of the most devastating floods to affect Britain in recent years were caused by storms driven by what's known as the jet stream. That's a fast-flowing air current high in the atmosphere. Predicting the path of the jet stream is one of the great challenges of weather forecasting, and now for the first time, scientists are flying directly through it to try to understand how it works. Our science editor, David Schuckman, has joined them.
Violent weather whipped up huge gales and unleashed devastating floods last winter. The storms were driven here by a powerful flow of wind high in the atmosphere, the jet stream. But we still don't really know how it affects our weather.
The jet stream is building nicely.
So a research plane heads out on a highly unusual mission. Outside on the wings, these aren't weapons, they're scientific instruments. I join the scientists on board. We're heading north. The aim is to try to improve the forecast of storms by learning more about the jet stream. Not just getting close to it, but actually flying right through it.
We know that if we don't get the jet stream right at the start point of a forecast, then that can affect the evolution of that forecast, and we could end up with a weather event which is not forecast or forecast at the wrong time or in the wrong place.
The jet stream races around the globe at high altitude, not in a straight line, but meandering like a river, and where it flows determines the weather we get in Europe. So flights from America, Iceland and Britain are researching its effect on storms.
We're now flying right through the heart of the jet stream. The winds are ripping along at 180 miles an hour. It's surprisingly calm, but this is the best way to try to understand the jet stream and how it affects our weather.
As we fly, small packages of instruments are dropped out of the plane.
Stand by. 3, 2, 1, release.
As they fall to the surface, they measure temperature and wind speed and transmit the data back. One discovery is that the jet stream is narrower than thought, which could drive storms towards us more rapidly than expected.
We've learnt that the jet stream's a lot sharper and stronger than we expected. And in fact, that's really important for the development of meanders on the jet stream and weather systems coming into Europe.
A Met Office animation shows the flow of weather across the Atlantic earlier this week, the great waves of the jet stream driving the storms. Warnings of intense rain and floods have become far more accurate in recent years. But across Europe over the past decade, scientists reckon at least 100 forecasts of extreme weather have failed. This latest research is meant to improve that record over the coming years. David Schuckman, BBC News.
Now, one of Germany's biggest lenders, Commerzbank, is cutting more than 20% of its workforce in a major restructuring programme designed to boost profitability. Commerzbank was bailed out by the German government during the financial crisis, and the state maintains a 15% stake in the bank. Our business editor, Simon Jack, is with me. Is this some kind of temporary pressure, Simon, or is it something much more worrying?
It's pretty severe, and I think the severity of these measures illustrate just how sick many of Europe's biggest banks still are. They're struggling with low interest rates, they've got a sluggish economy. This is Commerzbank's attempt to put its own house in order, cut costs. They say they're going to preserve capital, not pay it out to shareholders. Now, they're not alone. In fact, its bigger brother, if you like, Deutsche Bank, is the one that the entire world is looking at the moment. IMF, in fact, described it as the world's most dangerous, globally, systemically important bank. They were already reeling for the same reason as the Commerzbank, and then they got hit by this knockout blow when the US authority says, you owe us $14 billion to compensate us for problems during the subprime crisis. So a lot of people think they're not going to end up paying that much, but worrying that Deutsche Bank just can't handle that. They're going to have to raise extra money, or even possibly people are talking about turning to the government for help. Now, that would be hugely unpopular, possibly illegal. Italian banks are in the same situation, so governments are in a very delicate situation. It just goes to show this is not 2008, but the ghosts of that period still haunt some of our banks.
So when you say that, does it mean that there's an impact on our system here?
Well, all these banks are interrelated, as we found to our cost back in 2008. So there's no real direct exposure to, for example, to Italian banks, although, the UK does a lot of business with Deutsche Bank. So we're not quite in that situation. But RBS, for example, has the same problem as Deutsche Bank. It is still waiting for its bill from the US authorities. That could run into the double-digit billions. And until it's settled that, many people feel we're never going to get our money back, and it's going to struggle to make a profit.
Simon, again, thanks very much. Simon Jack, therefore, is our business editor. Right, to Canada then, because Prince George and Princess Charlotte were star guests at a children's tea party in Canada earlier today. On the latest leg of the royal tour of the country, grounds of Government House, the home of the Lieutenant Governor of British Columbia, was the venue for the event, which featured plenty of balloons and a few miniature ponies as well. Now, Seamus Heaney, widely regarded, of course, as one of the greatest poets of the 20th century, is the inspiration for a new arts and literary centre in the village of Bellaghy in Northern Ireland, where he was raised. It's been opened 3 years after the death of the Nobel winner, and our arts editor, Will Gompertz, has been there on a visit to sample Heaney's community and his work.
Between my finger and my thumb, the squat pen rests, snug as a gun. Under my window, a clean rasping sound when the spade sinks into gravelly ground. My father, digging.
Seamus Heaney, out and about in the countryside of rural Northern Ireland. It's where he grew up, a childhood home that became his lifelong muse. His parents built this house called The Wood. It's where he wrote his famous poem, Digging. His brother still lives there, farming the land that inspired Seamus's words.
I know he went to live in Dublin for 40 years, but in a way he never really moved far from here, did he?
Never moved. Never, no. Seamus never moved away. I my own way of putting it, I always say Seamus's feet never left the ground, He has been all over the world, but he's still in Bellaghy, still home.
Which is why the family has supported the idea of a centre celebrating his life and work being established in the small village of Bellaghy. It was, Seamus Heaney said, his home place.
This is the first exhibition space you enter, which places you firmly in Seamus Heaney's world. It also directly links his poetry with the people and places, friends and family that inspired him. Upstairs there's a recreation of the attic study he had at his home in Dublin. It includes personal photographs, some favourite books, his trusty fax machine, and the briefcase he took with him whenever he went abroad. There's also a creative zone where any budding bards can learn to build a poem, think about motivation, and even try on the clothes that inspired some of Heaney's most famous works.
I love it. I love it. Seeing how much the poetry is at the centre of it encourages me greatly, that it's about, yes, it's about the man, about the places and people around him, but it's really about the poetry, and it's a window into that, and I hope that's what people take away from it.
Mid-Ulster District Council have spent £4.25 million turning this old RUC police station into a poetry-themed art centre. For the Heaney family, it is a symbol of how times have changed in this part of the world. A place that was once associated with the Troubles is now devoted to learning, creativity and poetry.
Like a dull blade with its edge honed bright, Loch Beg half shines under the haze.
Words of Seamus Heaney, the opening of that new literary centre there in Bellaghy. Now, let's talk about Newsnight, because it's about to start on BBC Two. Here's Kirsty.
Tonight, Newsnight reveals details about the breakdown of relations in the child abuse inquiry, which led to the suspension of the League QC and the resignation of a junior counsel. Join me now on BBC Two, 11 o'clock in Scotland.
That's Newsnight with Kirsty here on BBC One. It's time for the news where you are. Have a good night.